Vamos por delante en el tiempo, son y 20 en vez de y media, pero creo que ya estamos todos en la casa, así que podemos empezar en el momento que queramos, ¿no? Bien, pues yo, como suelo empezar estas sesiones, estoy encantado de ver el salón lleno. Ver el salón del Museo Arqueológico lleno en las actividades que vamos organizando es una de las mayores satisfacciones que puede uno tener, y ver colas saliendo del museo para venir a una conferencia de historia, pues una doble satisfacción, porque no suele ser demasiado frecuente en los tiempos que corren, ¿no? Por lo demás, yo voy a ser tan parco en palabras que me voy a limitar a agradecer a nuestra conferenciante, por supuesto, y a todos los demás especialistas que van a colaborar a lo largo del ciclo de aquí al mes de diciembre, pero sobre todo quiero agradecer a la Comunidad de Madrid su colaboración. Sin ellos este ciclo hubiera sido imposible. Hemos empezado una relación de colaboración, bueno, pues que ha ido poco a poco estructurándose. Creo que con este ciclo pasa a ser palabras mayores, por así decirlo, y que en el futuro las líneas de colaboración conjunta serán mucho mayores, ¿no? Creo que en este caso, más que en otros, se puede decir que la unión hace la fuerza, literalmente, ¿no? Y le doy la palabra a Paloma Sobrini, directora general de Patrimonio Cultural de la Comunidad de Madrid, que hará una introducción al ciclo más sistemática.
Pues, querido Andrés, muchísimas gracias por acogernos en este fantástico museo, que todo hay que decirlo, en los últimos años ha triplicado la afluencia, y no me extraña con estas actividades, estas iniciativas tan estupendas. Es un honor poder contar como coordinadores científicos con nuestra querida amiga Melus, Carmen Fernández Ochoa, catedrática de la Universidad Autónoma de Madrid, y Javier Salido, querido Javier, de la Universidad Complutense de Madrid. Y es un inmenso regalo, tener hoy aquí entre nosotros a la prestigiosa profesora de la Universidad de Cambridge, Mary Baird, premio Princesa de Asturias de Ciencias Sociales 2016. Thank you so very much for being here with us, Mary. Y también agradezco de corazón a todos los profesores tan generosos que van a acompañarnos en estos ciclos de conferencias, y a toda la gente de la Dirección General de Patrimonio, que sé que se han dejado la piel en organizar este maravilloso evento. Y os transmito a todos el cariño de la presidenta de la Comunidad de Madrid y del director de la Oficina de Cultura y Turismo, que les ha sido imposible venir, pero que están con nosotros y lo estarán viendo en streaming. Somos una comunidad que nos tomamos en serio la arqueología, la investigación de nuestras raíces y la divulgación de nuestro patrimonio. Y los datos refuerzan esta convicción. Como he dicho antes, este museo, que ha triplicado su afluencia, se ha convertido en el museo del Estado con mayor número de visitas en todo el país. El interés de los ciudadanos, el interés por nuestras raíces y por la arqueología está sin duda en auge. La difusión del patrimonio histórico es una de las prioridades de nuestra política cultural que más satisfacciones nos ha aportado en los últimos años. A la vista del número creciente de visitantes tanto al Museo Arqueológico Regional, que nosotros tenemos en Alcalá de Henares y que tan estupendamente bien dirige y gestiona nuestro querido Enrique Baquedano, que en algún sitio estará. Estamos convencidos de que un ciudadano que conoce su historia, que conoce su patrimonio y lo entiende, es el mejor garante para su conservación, y en eso estamos trabajando con muchísima ilusión. El mundo romano tiene una presencia propia y constante en nuestro programa de difusión cultural, porque es imposible escaparse de esta realidad. Roma es nuestro mayor sustrato, nuestra lengua, nuestro derecho. Podemos decir que la primera noción del conjunto geográfico, humano, económico y cultural se alcanzó bajo su dominación. En cierto modo, nosotros todos seguimos siendo romanos y nos seguimos sintiendo como romanos. Y dentro de nuestra divulgación patrimonial, la antigua Roma ha sido siempre un tema recurrente. En el Museo Arqueológico Regional, como he dicho, hemos venido desarrollando diversas actuaciones y exposiciones a propósito de la romanización de la península ibérica, como han sido en estos últimos 2 años la exposición de los Escipiones, Roma conquista Hispania, y después, antes de verano, inauguramos Schulten y el descubrimiento de Numancia. En fin, hemos ampliado las posibilidades para que el público, la gente, se acerque a la arqueología, escapando también del ámbito exclusivamente museístico. Tenemos un plan de yacimientos visitables por toda la Comunidad de Madrid, un programa cuyo objetivo es acondicionar los principales yacimientos de la región para acercar al público nuestro patrimonio arqueológico, donde podemos todos ver de primera mano el trabajo de los expertos y poner en su contexto físico las muestras selladas. Hoy tenemos abiertos al público 14 yacimientos, pero esperamos ampliar hasta 29. Porque, queridos amigos, no podemos ni queremos detenernos en la investigación y en la difusión de nuestro inmenso legado patrimonial, por lo que seguiremos trabajando con más energía, aún si cabe. Y termino con un agradecimiento sincero y emotivo a la profesora Mary Bird por habernos permitido contar con ella y con su sabiduría, a los profesores Carmen Fernández Ochoa y Javier Salido, al director del Museo Arqueológico Nacional, Andrés, querido Andrés, y a todos los ponentes que nos acompañarán en estos días siguientes. Gracias a todos.
Muy bien, pues nosotros, Paloma y yo, ya les dejamos con Carmen Fernández y Javier Salido, los dos coordinadores del ciclo, que harán una introducción a la conferencia de hoy.
Muy buenas tardes. Es para mi compañero Javier Salido y para mí un enorme placer presentar este ciclo de conferencias que ha sido posible gracias al interés de la Dirección General de Patrimonio Cultural de la Comunidad de Madrid y también, como no, por la extraordinaria acogida que nos depara siempre el Museo Arqueológico Nacional, donde los especialistas en el mundo antiguo podemos sentirnos en casa. Si hace tan solo unos meses nos convocaba en este mismo lugar la presentación del libro El poder de Roma en tierras de Madrid, hoy tenemos la suerte de saludarles de nuevo para iniciar un ciclo de conferencias sobre el mundo romano estrechamente ligadas a nuestro quehacer de los últimos tiempos. Este ciclo de conferencias hunde sus raíces en nuestro personal convencimiento de que el pasado nos construye, nos explica, nos permite reconocernos. Son aspectos estos que han recibido un enorme empuje en los últimos años y nadie como la profesora Mary Bird, a quien damos calurosamente la bienvenida de nuevo, para enseñarnos, a partir de la difusión de la cultura clásica desde el rigor de las fuentes disponibles, cómo se puede acercar a la gente esta vivencia del pasado. Agradecemos su presencia, que se hace palpable hoy aquí, para introducirnos en la comprensión de la herencia romana en nuestro tiempo. Su forma de acercarnos al mundo clásico es la inspiración que subyace y alienta las sucesivas intervenciones que seguirán a la que hoy tienen ustedes aquí o van a disfrutar hoy. El ciclo responde, por lo tanto, a una idea que ella ha repetido en distintas ocasiones. La historia no va solo de encontrar el pasado, es una conversación con el pasado. Por eso este ciclo se llama así, Diálogos con el mundo clásico, con un amplio programa que comentará brevemente mi compañero Javier Salido.
Como pueden ver en el programa que les han repartido al inicio del ciclo o que han podido ver publicado en diversas webs, este ciclo trata muy diversos temas que nos acercarán a la vida cotidiana de la antigua Roma. Hemos seleccionado intervenciones de diversos especialistas que nos acompañarán en un paseo por el tiempo para conocer los imponentes y majestuosos edificios balnearios, los templos, los anfiteatros, pero también, y eso nos interesaba mucho, también adentrarnos en los rincones más recónditos, más íntimos de las residencias aristocráticas romanas. Temas tan actuales como el papel de la mujer, la globalización o el capitalismo completarán este viaje que les animo a recorran con nosotros cada miércoles en este museo, en el Museo Arqueológico Nacional. El objetivo es sacar al investigador, al académico, de las excavaciones arqueológicas y de las bibliotecas y acercar al público general y también a los especialistas las últimas novedades científicas sobre diferentes aspectos del mundo antiguo para establecer un diálogo, una conversación con debates que cerrarán cada una de las distintas intervenciones. Se pueden imaginar que no ha sido nada fácil para nosotros reunir a tantos especialistas de tanto prestigio Y hemos puesto todos nuestros esfuerzos en continuar la promoción y difusión del legado clásico romano, que ya iniciamos con la publicación del libro El poder de Roma, Madrid, una historia para todos. Presentamos, por tanto, un ciclo con alegría que desde hoy hasta el 20 de diciembre les ofrece la posibilidad de asistir cada miércoles a pequeños simposios con debates y el plato fuerte que son las conferencias. Pueden ver perfectamente que las mesas están preparadas y ya solamente faltan los invitados, que son ustedes. Muchas gracias. Sin más, paso la palabra a la catedrática del Departamento de Prehistoria y Arqueología de la Universidad Autónoma de Madrid, la doctora Carmen Fernández Ochoa, para iniciar la primera sesión de este ciclo de conferencias de la mano de la doctora Mary Bear, a quien agradecemos su asistencia. Es, sin duda, para nosotros todo un honor estar aquí hoy con ella.
Muchas gracias. He tenido la suerte de conocer a la profesora Mary Bear en Oviedo, también de acompañarla en algunas de sus intervenciones públicas. Pero sobre todo ha sido para mí un auténtico privilegio hacer de guía en su visita a nuestras excavaciones de la villa de Beranes, en Gijón. Una visita inolvidable por muchas razones para quienes estábamos allí presentes. Me llevaría, por tanto, mucho tiempo exponer en esta breve presentación su actividad como investigadora, como profesora, como clasicista comprometida con la difusión científica. Y yo sé que ustedes están deseando oírla a ella y no a mí. Pero, abreviando muchísimo, indicaré solamente algunos datos. Catedrática de la Universidad de Cambridge, miembro de la Academia Británica y de la Academia Americana de Artes y Ciencias, premio de Historia Bolson, escritora del suplemento literario del Times, autora de un conocido blog, Adon Life, la vida del catedrático, oficial de la Orden del Imperio Británico en 2013, premio Princesa de Asturias 2016 y medalla Broadley, es la Biblioteca Universitaria de Oxford, que ha recibido también el año 2016. Son, por tanto, una serie de datos mínimos para trazar su perfil, pero yo podría decirles que, sin embargo, yo creo que lo más interesante, desde mi punto de vista, es que es la clasicista más conocida del Reino Unido, yo creo, y también de otros países, Norteamérica, América, Europa y, en este caso, se puede notar en la afluencia de público que había hoy en la entrada del museo, que también de España. Sus publicaciones son muchísimas, yo no puedo hacer tampoco una lista. Recuerdo sus trabajos sobre religión, sus trabajos sobre el Partenón, el Coliseo, de los que se han traducido en la península ibérica, en España, el Triunfo Romano, Pompeya, la historia de una ciudad romana, la herencia viva de los clásicos y el SPQR, que es la última traducción que seguramente muchísimos de ustedes conocen y muchos venían con ella en la mano para que la profesora Bear les firmara este libro. Por tanto, es un trabajo inmenso a lo largo de muchos años que yo no puedo aquí ni pretendo tampoco resumir. Me interesa también destacar su trabajo de difusión científica. Yo creo que es fundamental. Para los investigadores tenemos la obligación de salir de las aulas, de salir del laboratorio y hacer una labor de este tipo. A ella la hemos reconocido en la BBC, en los programas de Pompeya, en la miniserie que también hizo Conocer a los romanos con Mary Bear, que fue muy conocida, muy famosa. Y gracias a estas series sobre Roma, a las series de Roma emitidas por Televisión Española, Roma, un imperio sin límites, que muchos recordarán, hemos visto a Mary Bear en distintos lugares de España, empezando por este mismo Museo Arqueológico Nacional y también en Sevilla o en Itálica. Ha pasado bajo las arcadas del acueducto de Segovia y, a la par que contemplaba su belleza y su alarde arquitectónico, comentaba en algunas de sus numerosas entrevistas lo innecesario de una obra de este calibre para surtir de agua a una pequeña ciudad meseteña, una ostentación solo explicable por el afán de Roma de exhibir su poder en provincias. Este ejemplo me sirve como punto de partida para comentar aspectos de su obra donde se refleja también su intensa personalidad y su profundo conocimiento del mundo romano. Leyendo sus últimas publicaciones de alta divulgación, Mary Bear parece revelar un debate continuo entre su ávido interés por Roma, la herencia que nos ha legado, y su implacable visión crítica acerca del proceder de los romanos. Me atrevería a decir que mantiene una fuerte dialéctica entre la valoración y la reprobación de la acción de Roma, porque el eje fundamental de su forma de historiar es la búsqueda de la verdad a través de un constante diálogo con los autores clásicos y con los expertos en el mundo antiguo. Toda su obra es una incisiva interrogación tanto a las fuentes antiguas primarias, literarias sobre todo, y arqueológicas también, en las que encuentra inmensos vacíos informativos, como a las interpretaciones especulativas de algunos historiadores que han creado mitos, positivos o negativos, pero carentes de fundamentos sobre la civilización romana. Este perfil combativo y exigente se expresa en sus escritos a través de un lenguaje tan inteligente como cercano, asequible a un público diverso, al que únicamente se le puede pedir, creo yo, un amor decidido por el conocimiento verdadero del pasado, hasta donde las ciencias de la antigüedad nos permiten llegar. Entre las muchas proposiciones que emergen de la lectura de su obra, destacan algunos temas a los que ha prestado especial atención. Su posición ante las cuestiones relacionadas con la historia de las mujeres es sobradamente conocida. Ver no ha escrito ninguna monografía sobre la mujer en la antigüedad, pero son espléndidas sus consideraciones sobre la versión más oscura de figuras como Livia, la esposa de Augusto, o sobre el mito de Cleopatra, sin olvidar su fundado escepticismo acerca del conocimiento que se puede tener de la vida y acciones de la reina británica Boudica. Años 60-61 de nuestra era. En la misma línea del tema de género, Meribert es convincente y conmovedora cuando se expresa con total franqueza en sus apariciones en foros públicos, relatando el papel de silencio obligado impuesto a las mujeres a lo largo de la historia. Quienes conozcan aspectos recientes de su biografía no pueden dejar de admirar su valentía para enfrentarse a los ataques machistas de las redes sociales. Del mismo modo, es relevante la utilización de estos medios para expresar su libre opinión sobre aspectos muy diversos de la realidad presente en la vida de las mujeres, así como sobre las actitudes reprobables de la situación política actual. En su amplia bibliografía, descubrimos que Meribert se ha sentido atraída por algunos personajes célebres de la historia de Roma, a los que trata de desenmascarar, como demuestran sus famosos trabajos sobre Cicerón. Su relectura de las cartas y discursos del corpus ciceroniano responde siempre a una búsqueda de la verdad, como decía antes, al descubrimiento de la otra cara de la historia, haciendo válida aquella frase del profesor Krebs que decía ver lo que otros ven y pensar lo que otros no han pensado. Esta máxima creo que recorre la obra de esta eminente latinista que tenemos hoy aquí, cuyas reflexiones y preguntas sorprenden siempre al lector, porque, entre otras razones, están exentas de prejuicios y se muestran cargadas de un poderoso realismo ajeno a la influencia de la historiografía al uso. Otro aspecto de enorme interés es su dedicación al estudio de la historia de las clases desheredadas del mundo romano. El título «Los que tienen y los que no tienen», del capítulo 11 de su conocida obra SPQR, es una muestra de ello. Otros alumnos conocidos, discípulos suyos, como Jerry Towner, por ejemplo, que han escrito también sobre cómo manejar a los esclavos, con el prólogo de la propia Meribert, etc., ofrecen al público una nueva visión de este sector de la sociedad injustamente olvidado. Se puede afirmar que hasta hace muy pocos años los especialistas en el mundo antiguo, y en el mundo romano en concreto, expertos en textos, en epigrafía o en arqueología, centraban la atención de forma preferente en las élites sociales. En el caso de la arqueología, creo que lo hemos vivido todos, es bastante claro, en el caso de la historia antigua también. Y yo creo que si algo hemos conseguido en estos años es acercarnos más a los espacios y a las gentes más sencillas que formaron parte también de los territorios dominados por Roma. Por último, y termino ya, otro de los ejes del discurso de la profesora Meribert son las alusiones a la influencia de Roma en la configuración del mundo occidental y a la herencia romana sobre la que ella entabla un diálogo fructífero. Considera que a los romanos no hay que imitarles, sino preguntarles las razones de su modo de hacer. Ciertamente, además de los testimonios escritos o materiales, el legado romano tiene mucho que ver con nosotros en numerosos aspectos de nuestra cotidianidad. como la lengua, los conceptos políticos y administrativos, las costumbres o ciertas nociones científicas y técnicas. Asimismo, asuntos de vital importancia como los derechos ciudadanos, las libertades civiles, la creación de redes de comunicación, etc., indudables logros de Roma, coexistieron con un descarnado poder dictatorial y con distintas formas de esclavitud, como desgraciadamente sucede también en la sociedad actual. Roma supo integrar a través de la civitas a todos los pueblos que formaron su imperio, otorgándoles estos logros. Fue una política inteligente que unas veces ejecutó por fuerza y otras mediante pactos, pero que logró una suma de voluntades a su favor como no lo había conseguido ningún otro imperio en la antigüedad. Bien es cierto que las comparaciones directas de Roma con nuestra realidad no tienen sentido, como la misma Ver ha aclarado, pero indudablemente constatamos unos rasgos de familiaridad con lo romano en los que aún nos reconocemos. La valoración ecuánime de esta herencia, como un componente más de las distintas identidades de cada región, debe contribuir a una mejor defensa y aprecio del patrimonio legado por Roma, un legado que Madrid también posee y comparte con distintos territorios romanizados. Termino agradeciéndole de nuevo el privilegio que nos otorga a todos con su presencia en esta sala para inaugurar estos diálogos con el mundo clásico que hoy se inician y que nadie como ella puede iniciar.
Sorry.
Maybe with the mouse. Is the PowerPoint now?
Where is it? Help.
One moment.
That's it.
Is it the first one?
No, that's the last one.
Okay.
Now go there. Perfect. Yeah.
Now.
There. Success. Buenas tardes. That, I'm afraid, is all the Spanish I'm going to be speaking tonight. I'd like to start by saying how very, very pleased I am to be here, how very ashamed I am to be speaking English, and I hope that nevertheless we will have a productive discussion thanks to the wonders of translation. It's obviously going to be an absolutely fantastic series of events over the autumn, and I hope that everybody will come back. For me, it's really wonderful to be here, to reconnect with this museum, which must be one of the best archaeological museums on the planet, I think. So it's been great. I want to set the scene just by really talking for about 15 or 20 minutes about some of the things that have already come up in what Carmen has said and others, before we get on to really having, I hope, a discussion. And I want to set the scene by thinking in very contemporary ways about some of the aspects of how Roman history engages with our own political debates, or perhaps better, how our own political debates engage with Roman history. There are all kinds of things, if one's thinking about the dialogue between us and the Roman world, there are all kinds of things that it would be worth talking about. I think it's impossible to make a big claim here. It's impossible to understand European literature if you don't know who Virgil is. And I think that, as I quite often say to people, Virgil's Aeneid is probably the only book in the world that someone has read every day, someone has been reading every day since Virgil didn't quite finish it, right? You can't say that about Homer, you can't say that about anything else. There's always been someone in Europe reading Virgil since 13 BC. Sadly, we might want to go back to that, but I'm going to be concentrating not so much on literature or artistic culture, but on politics. And the Roman Empire is, of course, as this slide makes very clear, part of our own political, popular culture. And I'm going to risk another generalization. I think there has not been any leading male politician in the West who has not at some point being compared by some cartoonist to Nero fiddling while Rome burns. Obama was always being compared to Nero, and you have him there. Here you've got the ex-British Prime Minister Gordon Brown doing much the same thing. And of course, Donald Trump has not escaped. And rather wonderfully, the cartoonist has got two jokes on him because he's saying, how the hell do you work this thing? So he's being wonderfully, wonderfully dumb. We recognise these bits of political satire from newspaper cartoons and on. And it's not only, I want to remind you, something that satirists and comics do to politicians. Leading politicians are perfectly capable of comparing themselves to Roman emperors. This is probably an unfamiliar image to you, but that is actually Franklin D. Roosevelt, President of the United States of America, having a toga party and pretending to be an emperor at play, right? So I think that gives you some idea of quite how embedded that notion of modern political elite and the ancient political elite really goes. Now, we mustn't lose our sense of humour here. I do want to say this is, of course, a joke, right? This is meant to be funny. There are, however, I think, awkward sides that we have to examine a little bit when it comes to this joke. And I'm very struck, really, how much modern political journalism, I'm not talking here about the most highbrow journalism, but the average newspaper reporter has become, I think very interestingly, fixated on how to make the link, first of all, between Roman emperors and the modern politician. I can tell you that the most frequent journalistic inquiry I've had over the last 12 months has been the question, which Roman emperor do you think Donald Trump is most like? You know, is it Caligula? Is it Nero? Right? Now, it's always very hard to respond to that because I partly want to say, I don't think Trump's like any Roman emperor at all. Why? Just get real. Though sometimes I have to say it's good fun to tease the journalists, and you find an emperor that you know that they won't have heard of. And you say, oh, I think he's like Elagabalus. They write that down very, and you think that's, they're now going to have to go and Google it. Find out who Elagabalus was. You can see it as a learning, a mini bit of learning, teaching. But the point that I suppose I want to make here, and it's one that Carmen already alluded to, that those comparisons are fun. You know, I would be being completely dishonest if I didn't sometimes think, well, you know, so which emperor is Trump like then? But they're also, as I suggested, deeply misleading. That the idea that it is profitable to compare modern political leaders directly with Roman emperors, I think, is very, very... well, I think in some ways, as we'll come to see, there's certain dangers in it. It's not just misleading. And I think, from my point of view, that we have to think hard about what we think our engagement with the Roman world in particular is really for. And I think that you have to, I think, remove any idea that the Romans have got things to teach us. You know, we do not actually learn that it is a very bad idea to intervene militarily in Afghanistan because the Romans had such a bad time there. There are plenty of other reasons to know that it's a bad idea to intervene militarily in Afghanistan. We do not need to think about the Roman Empire to wonder whether the American Empire is about to not necessarily collapse, but to creak a little bit. And I think the idea that somehow the dialogue that we have with the Roman world is a kind of game of matching things, saying, oh, that's just like that, and thinking that you've solved it. I think that actually takes us down a wrong path. So I'm going to give you in a minute one, I think, very interesting and slightly upsetting version of that. And I think the important thing is this title, the title of this series of conferences is called. It is, as Carmen has said, it's about having a dialogue with the past. It's about using and engaging with the Roman world to give us an idea of how people can do things differently. I mean, I think that the Rome and history, and I think you could say it of other cultures' history, and I wouldn't claim that Rome was entirely and uniquely privileged, but it does start to help you look at yourself from the outside. One very obvious example of that, and it's one that I talk about in SPQR, and I was reminded of it when I drove through the centre of the city and I saw a banner saying "Refugees Welcome" this afternoon. I think Rome's whole history of conceiving itself as a place of asylum, Rome's history of seeing that it was founded by foreigners. Rome is a city that was always been foreign and has always welcomed foreigners. I think that teaches us something about ourselves. Now, I don't think you can just necessarily say, because the Romans did it, then so should we. I don't think that you can base a migration policy in the 21st century on something that Romans did in the 1st century. We live in a very different world. But it does help you to get outside your own assumptions about how things have to be. And I think the Romans help us see ourselves in a way that reminds us that we don't always have to do things the way we now do. Now, that sounds, I think, rather kind of slightly frothy and waffly, but I want to give you one example of how this came very much and very surprisingly to public attention in the UK just recently. Now, and this is a case of quite how edgy and raw, and I think important, debates about and around the Romans still are, and I think it raises questions of how we make the Romans mean something to us and how we best study and talk about them. The example I'm going to give you is a silly and small example, and it's a small example of a small media storm, but it's instructive. What you're looking at the screen now is a still taken from a video for children about the history of Roman Britain made by and for the BBC. You can find it online if you Google it. It is a domestic story of Roman Britain, focusing on one family who are a rather elite Roman family. I think we imagine that the man probably is the governor of Britain. He's a high-ranking Roman official, and as you can see in the picture, the governor of Roman Britain is not white. Now, just to give you a bit of background on this, I haven't actually talked, I only talked very briefly to the people who made this video, but I believe that the man in question that we're looking at here is a man called Quintus Lollius Urbicus, who was governor of Roman Britain in the 2nd century AD, and whose home was the town of Tidis in modern Algeria. Now, we have no clue, let me say, what Quintus Lollius Urbicus's ethnicity was. He might have been a Roman Italian migrant. He might, people often claim they know that he's Berber. There is no reason to suppose that. He might well have had some sub-Saharan inheritance. We do not know. But this rather innocent children's video, which had been shown in British schools and watched on British television for several years, actually, it was not new, was the cause of a media storm, because a prominent right-wing commentator and social media commentator in particular attacked this video on Twitter with the picture that you've got on the screen, saying that this was rewriting history. How could you present such a politically correct, modern, liberal, and entirely incorrect view of Roman Britain by having a leading Roman official being black? I saw this going on, somebody alerted me to it, and partly out of a sort of sense of justice, I replied on Twitter saying that it was a pretty accurate image of Roman Britain. I didn't think anything to that. I just thought, you know, someone's attacking this wrongly and I will defend it. I did not realize that I was going to be absolutely deluged with tweets and emails and abuse and abuse of all kinds of sorts, I have to say. You know, if I say that, to say that they call me, you know, a fat, stupid old broad, that is on the polite end of the spectrum of what I got, right? I had on one day when this was going on, and Twitter storms don't last very long, this one lasted about a week, I had more than 4 million Twitter impressions, right, in a single day. And actually the people who were doing this got sort of actually horribly inventive. I'm going to have to go past these. They started mocking up books that I was supposed to have written, which turned every great British hero black, right? The Real William Shakespeare by Mary Beard. That one is quite kind of mild. There was the Real Romeo and Juliet. Every British battle, you know, the Spanish Armada, I'm afraid, was turned into a conflict between white Spain and black Britain. and on and on and on. You think, you know, don't these guys have something better to do? I mean, you know, I hate this, but, you know, it's clever. Now, the point I suppose I'm making is that, I'm going to go back a couple, is that when I said this is a broadly accurate, a pretty accurate representation of Roman Britain, and that the cartoonist, as I, you know, in the middle of this, I did actually bring out the name Quintus Lollius Urbicus, right, to defend this cartoon. There is absolutely no doubt whatsoever that Roman Britain was an ethnically mixed community. Absolutely no doubt. On the screen here, you've got one of my favorite tombstones from Hadrian's Wall, which is put up by a Syrian who presumably was a Syrian trader or army hanger-on from the city of Palmyra, put up to his British wife. It's a mixed marriage between a Syrian trader called Barates and Regina, called Queenie, his wife. It's a nice tombstone, which is a nice example of a material cultural mix, because although in some ways it's quite kind of very Roman and most of it's written in Latin, it's also evoking some sides of traditional Palmyrene tombstone, and although the main inscription is in Latin, he has written Regina farewell in Aramaic at the very bottom. Now, okay, that's not, when I pointed this out on Twitter, they said, oh, but not black, no, Syrians aren't black. So here is an example where we have really clear skeletal evidence of people in Roman Britain with sub-Saharan ancestry. Doesn't necessarily mean that they were born in Africa, but somebody in their family was. This is a skull from York in the north of Britain, and it is 99% certain. The analysis of skulls and cranial formations is tricky, but it is 99% certain that this woman has some sub-Saharan ancestry in her. She's also quite rich, to judge from the tomb goods that were found with her, and there are actually plenty more. If this York lady is not sub-Saharan Africa, there are plenty others who certainly are. Right? Recent work, in fact, in the archaeology of Roman Britain has shown by all kinds of different forms of analysis, which go beyond the analysis of cranial formation. There's some excellent work done on the isotope analysis of teeth, which can, it's only recently that I discovered that, that your teeth retain forever the imprint of the climatic conditions and diet that you had when those teeth were forming. So you can certainly see in Roman Britain. In urban communities, probably up to 25 or 30% of the skeletons of the teeth that have been analysed show that the people in Britain come from somewhere climatically very different. Now, it doesn't mean they come from Africa. Could have come just from nice warm Spain, right? Would have been. But some of them probably did come from Africa. Now, so what I think is extremely interesting is this combination. You know, the fact that this, within people working on Roman Britain now, the multi-ethnicity, the multiculturalism of the urban inhabitants of Roman Britain is totally uncontroversial. The poor old BBC make a children's video showing just this, when actually, you know, as I did at one point say, look, it's just a cartoon, for God's sake. You know, you can't tell someone's ethnicity from a cartoon. You know, we don't know where that guy came from, but that it can cause such intense controversy. It was covered by, mostly supportive of me, I have to say, it was covered by most British daily newspapers, and it took up an awful lot of time on Twitter. And I found myself afterwards reflecting on the nature of the controversy. And it has to be said, I think, that the kind of argument that was going on was marked by inaccuracy and misunderstanding and bad arguments, actually on all sides. I think it was worst on the side that wanted to say there couldn't have been any black people in Roman Britain, right? But they were mirrored by some people who said, yeah, loads, you know, and you know, look, you even have a black Roman emperor in Septimius Severus, you know, and you say, well, hang on, you know, Septimius Severus might have been black, he comes from Libya, he wasn't necessarily so. So there's a huge polarization and huge overconfidence on the social media about precisely, you know, what is going on here, how we should view Roman Britain. And of course, there were the crudest kind of projections of modern British debates about migration onto the Roman world. And it was a revelation that a myth of the British past, which sees no black person in Britain before 1950, was here being projected right back to the Romans. That the only way you could think and talk about Roman Britain was to see it as ethnically white. They might have been slightly more tanned than the British, but they were white. As I say, when I kind of got, you know, stood above all the people who were calling me a kind of fat, stupid old broad, I was also very struck by not just the polarization here, but the absolute unwillingness of those engaging in social media, and there was a lot of them, to think about uncertainty. You know, if you say, we do not know what ethnicity Quintus Lollius Urbicus was, we do not know what ethnicity Septimius Severus was, you don't get very far on the social media. They say, come on, of course, you know, somebody must know. And then people would go to statues of Septimius Severus and say, but he looks white in these. Yeah, he made him bloody marble, you know. Of course he looks white. Everybody looks white when they're in marble, right? There was also a kind of unnerving commitment of people to want to ask the question, which they held against the BBC, was this typical? Because at a certain point, rather foolishly, the BBC had labelled this a typical Roman family in Britain. An error, I have to say. And I said it was an error. If you say, there is no such thing as typical when you're talking about Roman Britain, that, you know, you would not have found multiculturalism, multi-ethnicity amongst peasant farmers. You would have found it in towns. People would still say, but how many were there then? You know, how many? You say, we do not know what the population of Roman Britain is or was. So I can't possibly, you know, I can't give you a proportion of how many people would not have been white, because we don't know how many people there were altogether. This doesn't, I tell you, it goes down very badly on Twitter, that argument. I suppose what I came away thinking, this is where I'm going to stop, is that somehow, even if this risks sounding slightly kind of elderly, academic, and slightly patronising, and I don't mean it to sound like that, I mean, I do think that those of us who are engaged professionally with the study of the Romans do have an obligation to get out there into these debates, also to make those debates better. And I think that, and this is one of the things I think which is headlined by the series here, and we do not want ancient history, Roman history, or any sort of history to be something that only people who teach it in schools and universities have a right to contribute to. No, history is dead if it is just an academic subject. We want people to engage with and to contribute to and enjoy the controversies of history. It can't be only for professionals. But somehow, and this I suppose I kind of came away thinking, you have to make sure people realise that that debate has to be in some way informed. You cannot, debate about history is not just sounding off about your prejudices. And I stopped short occasionally in these Twitter exchanges of saying what I desperately wanted to do after a bit, which is saying, so who's the professor of Roman history in this? I think it's me, not you, right? I thought, no, that would be inflammatory. Do not say that. But I did sometimes say, your views are really very interesting. Could you tell me what you've actually read about Roman Britain? What books have you read about Roman Britain? Some of them, to be fair, did have the honesty to say, well, I haven't read anything. At that point, you say, right, okay, here's a reading list. Go away and read it, and then we can talk. And I think we have to find a way, and I think this series is one of the things that might help. We have to find a way of a middle ground between just saying only people like Beard can talk about Roman history. That is not true. But also not just letting the debate about history become something that anyone can sound off, saying, well, weren't any blacks in Britain, were there? There is a middle ground between the two, and that's what I hope we will be exploring. Thank you.
Muchas gracias a profesora Ver por esta entretenida y amena y que responde un poco a lo que nosotros queríamos, que se llamaba Roma y nosotros, ¿no? Entonces, es un poco la idea de qué es lo que nos dicen, qué es cómo de alguna manera se entrelaza la historia antigua con nuestra realidad presente, ¿no? Este es un poco el leitmotiv, de alguna manera, de su exposición. Y de acuerdo con lo que habíamos planificado en la organización de esta sesión, ella quería que el público le interpelara, le hiciera preguntas y que la segunda parte de esta concentración de hoy fuera precisamente la posibilidad de preguntarle directamente a ella algunas cuestiones que pudieran interesar a las personas que están aquí y que interpelarían sobre los temas de Roma y nosotros concretamente, y la forma que tenemos de entender esta civilización, esta cultura y lo que, como decíamos antes, nos queda de ella o podemos valorar de ella. De tal manera que esta parte segunda pues, está abierta a las preguntas de todos ustedes. Y querríamos, en este sentido, ella contestaría, daría la respuesta a las sugerencias y a las preguntas que se le hagan a partir de ahora, ¿no? Bien, hay Adolfo, profesor Domínguez Monedero.
Sí, muchas gracias. Enhorabuena por su charla. Muy interesante y un poco ya de alguna manera lo ha respondido, ¿no? Pero en la línea de las cosas que he ido diciendo, yo quería preguntarle qué presente y qué futuro ve para el conocimiento y el aprovechamiento, ¿no?, del mundo antiguo en nuestra sociedad actual. visión sobre todo centrada no en el especialista, sino, como también ha dicho, en el público en general. Es decir, cómo el público puede, no el especialista, puede aprovechar este mundo antiguo, si es que se puede aprovechar este mundo antiguo. Muchas gracias.
I'd like to start the answer by saying I'm an optimist. I think that people who study ancient history and tend to be very nostalgic. They tend to imagine, particularly when it comes down to things like Latin and Greek, that somehow everybody in the past knew about the ancient world much more deeply than we do. They all read Latin, that there was some place back then, there was an absolute paradise of classical knowledge, public discourse, education, and that we are just, we're losing it. Now, everything I've done recently on the study of ancient history and Roman literature and culture and language over the last 500 or so years shows me absolutely that that is not true. My predecessors in Cambridge in the late 19th century were always saying, oh, the students don't know Latin like they used to. They were looking back to a glory day somewhere in the 18th century. The Romans themselves, I think, thought that everything was better about 200 years before, whenever they were. And I think to some extent, while I want to fight for keeping a really high level of the study of ancient cultures and ancient languages throughout the world, I'm kind of optimistic. I think that there's a great future actually in our debates about the Romans, the Greeks, and let's hope we might be able to broaden that kind of cultural remit a bit. I think that, in some ways, in a way to put a slightly different spin on what I said in my talk, I think that there is something, even though I do not want to claim that somehow the Romans are uniquely important to us. And happily it is the case that modern European culture is not just the kind of descendant of ancient Rome. Happily it's not, because we wouldn't like it if it was. Nevertheless, that wonderful combination of similarity and difference, I think, really makes it a productive area for people to talk and to discuss, and I think it will go on doing that. I think in the television programs I've made, I think what people have very much liked is the sense that you can talk, well, I think talking about slavery is very interesting there. And I think that if you go to a class of children in Britain, it may be different here, who are learning about the Romans aged 12, 13, let's say. And one thing they'll do is they'll say, the Romans had slaves. And the teacher, and I've seen this in action, the teacher will say, do we have slaves? And they say, no, miss. No, we don't have slaves. Now, actually, one of the most enlightening bits of making the television programs, I think, was trying to get people to see that their own moral superiority about not having slavery was built on nothing. Of course we have slaves. We don't call them slaves, but of course we have slaves. It's like going to the Colosseum. If you listen, as I've done, because when you're making television programs, you have endless time, endless when you're not doing anything and you're just waiting around. So you can listen to what kids are being told in the Colosseum. And I can tell you, I do know that this is entirely cross-European. Every school party from every European country whose language I can half understand gets the teacher, and the teacher says, what happened here? And usually a little boy answers and says, oh, it was gladiators, miss. They were killed, people killed each other, for pleasure, etc., etc. And then the teacher says, would we do that kind of thing now? and all the class say, "No, miss." You know, and the temptation to go up and say, "Excuse me, you know, have you looked at the health record of boxers?" You know, but there is something there that we're invested in, we're engaged in, which is different and the same, and we can use it wonderfully as a lens to look at what we don't like about ourselves. You know, yes, we do have slaves, and yes, we do kill people for pleasure.
Muchas gracias. Almudena Orejas.
Buenas tardes. En primer lugar, yo también querría agradecer la intervención llena de sugerencias y de guiños a muchos temas del pasado y actuales. Me gustaría retomar el tema de cómo los especialistas somos capaces de comunicar el conocimiento que generamos al conjunto de la sociedad. Y en particular me gustaría referirme a un aspecto que es el patrimonio arqueológico. El patrimonio arqueológico es accesible, está abierto, hay visitas y por lo tanto puede ser una excelente oportunidad de comunicación. Pero mi impresión es que a veces desaprovechamos esta ocasión y los propios especialistas tendemos a banalizar, a frivolizar el discurso sobre el mundo antiguo. Me gustaría una pequeña reflexión sobre cómo podemos usar ese patrimonio abierto y muy accesible para entrar en un discurso más complejo sobre la sociedad, sobre la alteridad, sobre algunos de esos aspectos que nos ha desgranado en la reunión. Gracias.
I think that's very important. And I mean, I'm going to answer it a little bit autobiographically because I've had exactly the same worries that you're expressing. To start with, I was very, very reluctant to do any television for precisely the reasons that I thought television ironed out complexity, it did tend to trivialize, there was a certain frivolity about serious questions. So when I got an offer to do a programme, I said I really didn't think that I wanted to. Then there was one very powerful woman very high up in the BBC, and she said, "Look, that's completely unreasonable of you. You know, you go on all the time about how the Romans aren't properly presented on the television. You go on all the time about how the only presenters you see on history documentaries are wrinkled old men or very beautiful young women. I'm offering you a chance to present the Romans like you want and to be an old woman on television, and you're now telling me you're not going to do it," right? So I said, okay, you know, I surrender, right? But I still had those doubts. And I think that I tried to protect myself against it. And one of the things that I said I was not going to do, nobody in any programme I made was ever going to dress up like a Roman. There was going to be no drama reconstruction, right? You know what it's like. You've got the banquet, and they're all very bad actors, and they're dressed in sheets, and they're saying, "Oh, pass the dormouse, Marcus," or you know, "A little more wine for me," or "Have a grape, Claudia." You know, it's just terrible, absolutely awful. Because I thought that was the main access, where not only trivialization came in, but also the kind of, what we were just talking about, the kind of spurious similarity between us and them. That said, I think that, well, look, you have to get people to watch telly. And you get them to watch, and it's a different way of getting them to watch from getting them to read a book. And how do you get, particularly, because I have a very wide audience in mind, but I do want, you know, teenagers to watch. You know, and I'm afraid sometimes I do go down the, you know, the frivolity pattern. I say, you know, how many times have I sat on a Roman lavatory in my programs? Very often, you know, because you instantly, you know, when you say, do you know how they wipe their bottoms? It was a sponge on a stick. And they say, no, you know. I think the defense I have is that I think that kind of, you know, if you're wanting, you know, 4 million, 5 million audience, you make some compromises. But the defense is that more often than not, you can turn what looks like trivialization into a big point. You can use it as a way of getting people to look at complexity. You know, what is it that's different about Roman culture that they have communal lavatories? Right? Now, every teenager will love to do the lavatories and the sponge. Well, perhaps I'm being a bit unfair on teenagers, probably every 10-year-old. But there are actually things about how you reconstruct the Roman world. How do we know they used sponges on sticks? Actually, about 2 literary texts, no more. What sort of culture does this mean? What does it say about gender division? You know, who used these lavatories? Was it just men? Because today men have communal lavatories, but we don't call them that in quite the same way. So do we think there was women here? That takes you into all kinds of issues about how you can read an archaeological site. I accept that it's, you know, because I think it would be disingenuous not to. You know, it's playing it a bit for laughs. But I don't mind playing something for laughs if it leads to a point that is important, if it helps people get into it. And I resist this, but when I resist it, I'm usually wrong. When we were making our latest film on Roman Empire, my producer said, look, I know what we want to do. We're going to go to a restaurant and you're going to explain the late antique division of the Roman Empire by cutting up a pizza, right? You're going to go to a pizza restaurant and you're going to cut up the pizza and then you're going to say, so Diocletian took that bit. And it took her about a month to convince me to do that. And I gave in. I got endless emails from people saying, God, it was the first time I saw really what the splitting of the Roman Empire was all about. And at that point I had to say, well, I'm sorry, it wasn't my idea, you know. You know, we had the regional capitals being the olives, you know. It worked a treat. Though it looks, you know, it's a trick, but it's not dressing up. I will not dress up.
Sí.
Buenas tardes. Yo quería preguntarle, bueno, me imagino que también conozco un poco la respuesta por lo que ha comentado, pero quería decirle que a veces llaman la atención algunos términos que utiliza cuando describe la historia de Roma, y términos que a lo mejor podrían ser un poco anacrónicos. Por ejemplo, en el último libro en ese TQR, en el capítulo dedicado a Catilina, pues la traducción en castellano se dice que es un sagaz terrorista, y eso pues llama la atención. O cuando se habla de Julio César, se menciona la palabra genocidio o criminal de guerra. Entonces son términos bueno, que chocan en un contexto de historia antigua.
There's real dangers in that. And they're dangers that I'm aware of, and they're the kind of dangers that we've been alluding to several times, you know, that by using those kinds of words, like terrorism or genocide, one tends to erode the difference between the ancient world and the modern. And they're over-familiar in some ways. And I accept that. but I accept the potential loss in using those terms. I think the price is worth paying. And I'll just give you one quick anecdote about, in a sense, where I rather changed my mind. I have taught for about almost 40 years. I have taught clever undergraduate students at university about the plot by the what should we call him? Can't call him a dissident. Plot by the aristocrat, the young aristocrat Catiline, against the Roman state that was uncovered by the great hero of Rome, Cicero, who, after he had uncovered Catiline's plot, despite the fact that it was fundamentally in conflict with the Roman constitution, that a citizen should be put to death without trial, Cicero did exactly that. He unearthed the conspiracy he believed he had. He killed the conspirators without trial and was later on exiled for precisely flouting the constitution. I taught that for many years in much those terms. Right? And undergraduates, students' eyes used to glaze over. You know, Cicero is very boring, actually, to most students. The Catilinarian conspiracy was really just an excuse for making you read loads of Latin, and it was all terribly distant. It was just one year when I kind of thought, oh, God, I've got to do this, you know, I've got to do this differently. And I just said, look, you know, actually, isn't this like Homeland Security? Don't we constantly have a debate about how far it is legitimate to suspend civil liberties in order to protect the state? Isn't that what our debate about how terrorism should be handled? Isn't that what it's all about? Suddenly, their eyes opened. Right? And they got interested in Catiline, and they got interested in how you could understand Cicero's position, you know, actually caught between flouting the constitution, flouting what was effectively the regime of civil liberties, on the one hand, while also being under an obligation as consul to defend Rome and keep Rome safe from terror. And at that point, they started arguing. Right? And I thought, blimey, you know, this is better. You know, they were, you know, you can imagine Tony Blair and the Iraq War and everything. You know, suddenly it seemed important to them. And I suppose I guessed then that if, you know, the occasionally, I think, occasionally slightly naughty use of a modern term, actually, as it were, threw a different light onto something that was always just about, oh, you know, ancient history, it was probably worth it. But it's a trade-off, it's a trade-off. So, yeah.
A ver, después y después.
With the Romans in both the British Isles and the Iberian Peninsula, not only how they felt about the different regions strategically and culturally and so on and so forth, or how easy it was for them to conquer it, but more importantly, I guess, what the attitude of the natives was to the Romanization, not only at that time, but in subsequent civilization. So how much of Roman heritage and how Romanization worked beyond Monty Python?
Monty Python isn't that bad, really, I think. I think he's quite good on what the Romans did for us. I think it's really interesting. and just to start at the end first, my sense is, though you'll have to tell me if I'm wrong about Spain, my sense is that in some ways the British, partly because of the British Empire, I guess, the modern British identify very strongly with the Romans. Not entirely. You know, we still have outside the Houses of Parliament, we have a statue of the greatest British female warrior rebel against the Romans, Boudica, although she has an inscription on her which somehow makes her almost Roman, because there's a poem written, this great statue of this massive warrior queen, you know, about to kind of, you know, she's unsuccessful in the end because all Roman rebels are unsuccessful, but for a time she burns down Roman towns, etc. She's got scythes on her chariot. Underneath it says something like, "Don't worry, Boudica." It's a poem, it's better than this. "Don't worry, Boudica, because your descendants will rule over more territory than the Romans ever did." Right? So somehow Boudica becomes therefore a kind of more Roman than the Romans. But by and large, you know, when people go into a museum, I think it's quite interesting to listen to a British Romano-British museum. They tend to identify with the Romans, not the natives. You know, they look, you know, they get dressed up in Roman, you know, more costume. They do toga parties, that's right. They put on helmets. You know, they don't dress up as native Britons, right? So now I don't quite know how it works in Spain. My sense is that the British are particularly vulnerable to somehow thinking of themselves as Romans in their heads. I think that the other questions going back, I mean, you know, basically the irony of that is that Britain was the absolute backwater province, and Spain was not. Whichever bits of the Iberian Peninsula, whichever bits of province you take, you know, Hispania, Quiterio, or whatever, they were on the map. Britain is the only province in the Roman Empire from which no senator is known. You know, you get emperors from Spain, right? You know, Spain is central. And despite despite this kind of absolute fixation on the British Empire being like the Roman Empire, actually Britain was nowhere. You know, Britain, you know, when Julius Caesar came to Britain, it was a bit like kind of going to the moon. It was so remote, right? You know, and about as fruitless, actually, about as fruitless. The other bits of the question are very hard because, of course, we don't know who we're talking about when we're talking about the provincials, you know, both in Spain and Britain. Presumably, at least 80% of the people were peasants. They were doing exactly what they did before. They were almost unaffected by Roman rule, except they got a nicer brooch or two, and they paid taxes to someone different. So, in a sense, the majority of the population is unaffected. For the elite, the urbanization of both Spain and Britain is absolutely crucial. In Britain, it gave Britain the geography and the urban geography it now has. But of course, who the Romans are, you know, are also a problem. And again, the British view on this, and it would be more true of Spain than of Britain. The British view is that somehow there are these poor Italians who come up from, you know, they've been living in sunny Rome, and they have to come and they have to serve on Hadrian's Wall, and it's raining and it's foggy, and they're terribly homesick, right? Actually, so far as we can tell, the vast majority of people who were serving on Hadrian's Wall were Romans from Germany and the Netherlands and places like that, where it was just as dirty and foggy, you know. And in a sense, part of the excitement of the multiculturalism of the Roman Empire is that people from all over the Western world count as Romans. It's only Britain that's really, you know, Britain is really marginal. Yeah.
Buenas tardes. Muchísimas gracias por esta conferencia tan sugerente, llena de temas realmente interesantes. Yo quería seguir un poco con la línea de la romanización y enlazando con esta idea de la diversidad étnica de Britania, pedir su opinión sobre si no estamos manejando tanto en la escala de los investigadores como a escala popular una visión muy estereotipada de lo que son los romanos. Basada probablemente en ese todo homogéneo que construyó la ideología del imperio, ¿no? Como una ecúmene de civilización, que luego es recuperada por la tradición historiográfica sobre la romanización, en último término. Sin embargo, a mí me parece que además de esa Roma que se considera civilizadora, hay otras Romas que a lo mejor no civilizan, sobre todo en época republicana, que usted conoce tan exhaustivamente. Entonces, ¿no deberíamos a lo mejor hacer más hincapié, no solo ya en la diversidad de los pueblos conquistados, sino también en la propia diversidad de las formas de dominación romana?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And I think I agree that we tend to homogenize Rome, and I'm guilty of that. Not when I'm teaching students, but when I'm talking on television. I mean, people often say, when you talk television, don't you find that very different from talking to students, teaching students? And the answer is usually no, it isn't. You know, that you're dealing with just the same issues. Though I do think there's one case where you do fudge for a wide audience and you don't for students, which is in the very, very different, you know, leaving aside all kinds of other ways that the Romans were not homogeneous, the idea that somehow, you know, a Roman of the 4th century BC had anything in common with a Roman of the 3rd century AD. And I think you're right to say that we smooth that over too much, because we just talk about the Romans. I was taught by a very great ancient historian, Moses Finley, who was a great American refugee from McCarthyism, came to Cambridge. He wasn't much interested in Roman history, but he was interested in Greek history. And he always used to say, when anybody said, you know, Professor Finley, did the Greeks, and he'd say, which Greeks, when, where? Right? We ought to be doing that much more when we say the Romans. The kind of defence is that I think that there is a sort of big problem built into looking at the history of Rome, that we tend, I think, to turn a blind eye to a little. That everything we see of Rome, more or less, not absolutely, but 99% of the physical architectural remains, sculptural remains, 99% of it dates from the empire. On the other hand, most of the literature that my students read is either written in or about the Republic. So there's a kind of broken back here that the visual image that we have of ancient Rome is the Rome of autocracy, it's the Rome of marble, it's the Rome of planning. The literary image we have, not entirely, but very largely is weighted to the Republic. Now, I've been working recently on images of Roman emperors, and I've been very struck that actually when you get radical republican movements, you know, such as in the French 18th century, you know, they have real trouble with actually imagining what Republican Romans look like. They have to invent them. You know, our image of Republican Romans really goes back to, you know, the painter David more than anybody else, because we don't really have any Republican Romans that we can look at. And so there is built in there, I think, a problem when you want to kind of get people up close and personal. You know, the one person we can really get up close, the only Roman we can really know is Cicero, you know, and he's in the Republic. We have no idea what the Rome of Cicero looked like. So we can't match. And I think that's a fundamental difficulty for for communicating more widely. You know, you can't say this is Cicero's house, because, you know, what can you tell people about the Rome of the Republic? It was a rabbit warren made of brick, you know, very dirty, no marble, right? They don't tend to get very interested when you say that.
Muchas gracias. Por favor. Uno de los dos.
Hi, huge admirer here. So much so I'm hoping to earn a nice education here, maybe later. Anyway, I'm a student of international relations at the London School of Economics. And it is perhaps so...
Oh dear.
I know. But it is perhaps so that one of the claims that you make, I think both in the book and in the TV series, is about when Caesar goes to the Gauls and is fighting the Gauls there, there's some concerns back in Rome about the crimes against humanity, something similar to it. Humanity is obviously a modern notion, or at least as we understand it. I mean, this seems to resonate with Tacitus later saying they make it desperate.
I can call it peace.
Peace, of course, very famous. You've spoken about the Roman world, but what was the world in which the Romans lived in like? There was a notion of international law.
Yeah.
What was the notion that the Romans had of everyone outside their empire, and how did they relate with these people, especially when the empire stopped growing? Thank you very much.
I think that the Romans are much more interesting on this subject than people give them credit for. You know, the other side of the Monty Python image, well, it would be Asterix the Gaul, wouldn't it? The Romans are brutal conquerors, and they never think. They do not think about governance, they think about slaughter. Now, actually, it only takes a couple of minutes to see how that is only part of the story. I mean, you will know more about this than me, but I mean, I've got a general rule of thumb, I think, is that oppressors, and the Romans certainly were oppressors, tend to be much more sophisticated, by and large, about the nature of the oppression that they're enacting than we give them credit for. If you want an analysis, and a critical analysis of Roman imperialism, go to a Roman. You know, and they were well capable, like Tacitus, of giving you an analysis of that. I think where it gets intellectually interesting is that to say that the Romans really invented any form of international law would be going way too far. On the other hand, you only have to go and look at the legal codes in this museum written on bronze, where Romans are thinking about the very nature of how communities outside Rome could and should live and conduct themselves, to see that they are making the first step. I mean, it sounds very teleological, but I don't mean it to be. They are improvising an idea of what it is to govern. And you see that if you go back, I think, to the 2nd century BC and the extortion law of Gaius Gracchus, which also survives in quite large quantity thanks to an inscription, one of the few republican laws that we've got really a lot of. And again, students tend to be rather bored with, you know, if you call, you know, the Romans had a law against extortion in the provinces and total glaze over. If you actually get them to read the text of Gaius Gracchus's law, and you can begin to see Romans thinking about conflicting interests in provincial communities and how those might be fairly judged back at Rome, and what the responsibility of the Roman power was in relation to the mistreatment of those that it was governing. And the thing that struck me most of all when I was looking carefully at that, nobody ever really refers to, is that when there are all sorts of things that are wrong, and you know, no provincial really would want to take the Romans to court, even though they could. But it says, nobody should be allowed on the jury who is in the same club as the Roman defendant. Now, you think, right, actually, they've got a conflict of interest notion here. You know, they're working it out. But it's a very, very long way from any sense of, Rome still has one foot in the idea that international relations are conducted by bullies and by bullying and by war. You know, it hasn't entirely moved from that, but in part it has. Thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Buenas tardes. En primer lugar, pues quiero agradecer todas estas sugerencias y las interesantísimas reflexiones que ha tenido a bien compartir con todos nosotros. Mi pregunta va un poco por la línea política, pero también desviándome un poco hacia el terreno de lo femenino, que todavía no ha salido esta tarde, y es sobre unas mujeres un poquito particulares de la antigua Roma, las vestales. Me gustaría saber cuál es su punto de vista, su opinión, qué opina usted sobre la posición que estas mujeres ocuparon en el mundo antiguo desde el punto de vista tanto político como simbólico, legal, sexual, en fin, un poco las reflexiones que usted quiera compartir con nosotros. Muchas gracias.
Thank you. Vestal virgins, as you probably know, they also occur often in movies, usually when they're about not to be virgins, actually, I think is the... They are the 6 virgin priestesses who guarded the sacred flame of Rome in the Forum and had a very nasty death if they were found to have broken their vow of chastity or indeed let the fire go out that they were supposed to be guarding. Vestal virgins are very close to my heart because they were the subject of the first article I ever wrote, which I wrote for, this is back when I was about 22 or 23, a long time ago, 40 years ago. And I was a graduate student working on Roman history, and it was still kind of whatever wave feminism it was, second wave feminism or whatever. And I wanted to find some women. I knew that, that Roman history wasn't a place where there were lots of them. I knew if you really wanted to work on women and nothing else, Roman history was a very stupid subject to choose. But I still thought there was a possibility of moving the goalposts a little bit. And so I decided, when I was asked to give a seminar, that I would work on the Vestal Virgins, because I thought here you could get, you could actually come face to face with women who had some power in the Roman community. They might have terrible punishment waiting for them if they weren't chaste, but they had front row seats at the theatre, they were allowed to free condemned criminals, all kinds of other things, and they had a very, very posh house in the Roman Forum. So I thought I would really, I would investigate them and I would look at their privileges. In a way, I found it disappointing, although I think I turned it to good in the end, because what it turned out was that very many of the privileges they had were privileges, I suppose this now sounds obvious, associated with men. So, I remember that kind of feeling of slight disappointment on my part, that I thought I'd found some powerful women, and yes, I had found some powerful women, but the only way in which they were powerful was because they had the privileges that men had. So that, in some ways I've worked on that particular dilemma, not relation to Vestal virgins, often thereafter. Why do female politicians dress like they do and speak rather low? It's because they're pretending to be men, right, at a certain level. And so here my wonderful priestesses, with all that glamour associated with them, and I began to feel that their femaleness was kind of disappearing the more I read. I later came back to it, and I thought in the end that I'd perhaps been a bit unfair on them, and I think that the idea that right at the heart of the Roman political space, the sexuality of women, even if a denied sexuality, was absolutely central, was actually more important than I'd given it credit for, that actually Rome was a culture that saw at its centre a female, non-reproductive female virgin. And that has to be important. I'm still not quite sure how it is important, but it has to be important. But I think I feel very sort of attached to the Vestal Virgins, partly because when people wrote about them in the early 20th century, they always said, oh, it's like Lady Dons in Cambridge and Oxford, you know. I thought, oh, that's me. But I think they're sexually more complicated. But still, it was the first article I ever wrote, and I love it, you know. So it's, yeah, I felt so proud when I saw it come out. And it was about women, but they were women who turned out not to be quite so female.
¿Alguna cuestión más?
Hola, buenas tardes. Sí,
¿Dónde?
Yo quería hacer, bueno, primero darle las gracias por compartir su conocimiento con nosotros. Y quería hacerle una pregunta relacionada con su vocación. Usted ha dedicado su vida a estudiar el mundo romano y también a darlo a conocer, dar a conocer la antigüedad. Supongo que hay muchísimas razones que explican esa forma de actuar y de ser una profesional en ese campo, pero si tuviera que elegir una razón por la cual es importante dar a conocer el pasado, ¿usted cree que es importante dar a conocer el pasado? ¿Con cuál se quedaría?
It has to be the old-fashioned reason that if you do not understand the past, you cannot understand the present. It is just as simple as that. And I came across, and that always sounds rather kind of blasé, kind of bland when you say it. But I think you can see how that works in all kinds of quite unexpected places. About 10 years ago, I did a rather stupid, talk about trivialization, this is terrible. I did a rather stupid reality TV show in which a celebrity chef called Jamie Oliver had got together a load of 16-year-olds who'd completely failed at school and televised them being taught by a load of people that he thought were celebrity academics. And I was teaching them Latin. I can tell you it was awful in some ways. It was very instructive in others. And I've never, ever since then had anything but total admiration of teachers who teach classes of 16-year-olds. But what was very interesting was actually exploring some of the consequences, and quite surprising consequences, of what happens to your engagement with the world when you know nothing of the past, really. And there was one occasion that I remember very vividly. I rather desperately on one lesson said, I thought we'd do Roman numbers. You know, we do X and V and 1, 1, you know, all that kind of stuff, Roman numerals. And although these kids were usually very, well, they didn't concentrate very well, they were absolutely agog. You know, they wrote all this down, they wrote C means 100, etc., etc. And at the end of this lesson, which had gone much better than I could ever possibly imagined, I said, oh, come on, why did you think that And it was interesting. You know, usually you're, you know, on your mobile phones, you're making a terrible noise, you're not concentrating. And today, on Roman numbers, you have been, you know, attentive. And they said, they looked at me as if I was slightly stupid. They said, but at the end of movies or at the end of television programs, the date is always in Roman numbers. And we want to know what it is. Now, that is a trivial and frivolous example, but I think it nevertheless slightly captures that sense of of how the modern world doesn't work for you unless you've got some capacity to at least have someone help you share the ancient. The other thing that they got very interested in is the derivation of town names, because they'd vaguely spotted in England that there were a lot of towns that ended things like Chester or Castor, you know, Manchester, Tadcaster, Doncaster, but they had no clue why. So when I said that was a place, it came from the Latin word for camp, castra, and it was a place where the Romans had had a fort or a camp, suddenly bits of English geography, which had just seemed like some kind of random peculiarity, suddenly started to have a reason. Now, I would not want to justify the study of Latin and Greek or ancient history on the basis of being able to know the date of a movie or, you know, why Tadcaster's called Tadcaster. But I think those are kind of little vignettes which which on a much bigger scale are what, you know, keeps me thinking this is important, you know. But I think you see it very clearly when you see those kind of slightly comic examples of it.
Muchas gracias. ¿Alguna cuestión más?
Yo quiero cerrar.
¿Tú?
Sí. A mí me gustaría cerrar el turno de preguntas.
¿Hay otra? No.
Con la intención...
Hay otra, espera.
Bueno, al final puedo hablar. Gracias en primer lugar a la profesora Maribel por su magnífica ponencia y las aclaraciones a los diversos turnos de pregunta. Yo querría plantearle una cuestión sobre, en una época de relativismo cultural, si la cultura romana es o era una cultura superior a otras culturas en ese momento. Porque es cierto que la conquista, el poder de Roma comienza por la conquista del territorio, pero el mantenimiento solamente es posible por un proceso continuado y progresivo de romanización. En ese sentido se nos plantea forzosamente si hay algo en esa cultura romana, que se convierte en hegemónica en ese contexto de conflicto cultural y, sobre todo, cuál sería la relación, que parece a la inversa, entre la cultura romana y la cultura griega.
I'm probably going to disappoint you because I'm very much a child of my time, and I long ago was told that I was a cultural relativist. You had to be. That's what you had to be. I think there are some things that are a bit more interesting than that, though, because I think that what the Romans show you is partly a culture which is debating its own order of precedence in the world. And I think that Rome's engagement with Greek culture, which it can play in many different ways. It can play, you know, we poor Romans are just, you know, thick bridge builders when the Greeks were really intellectuals. It can also claim that classical Greek culture, as they now see it, has become so attenuated and is in such total decline that, of course, the Romans are the top dogs. I mean, I suppose this is going to sound really under-analysed, but my own feeling is that the Romans gave us all kinds of, I'm now going to talk about literature, they gave us all kinds of literary works that we have read and studied as part of one strand of, albeit admittedly elite Western culture for 2,000 years, that whether it's any good or not is actually almost immaterial, or I happen to think it is, because it is so part of the way we have learned to think about ourselves that actually much more fundamentally a part of the way we think about ourselves than Greek literature and culture, which in terms of the rediscovery was so much later and so much more specialized. I mean, Greek has always been a minority option in Europe for everybody. Latin was not. And I think that, like it or not, whether it's better or not is not, so I'm not particularly interested in whether it's better. What I'm interested in is that it is that we cannot be fully operating cultural human beings unless we in some way engage with the Romans. Now, I think that just so that I don't seem like a kind of cultural Stalinist, I don't think that, I'm not saying by that that, every school child has to learn Latin and has to, that Latin should be compulsory and that ancient history should be compulsory. I mean, I think that the point about culture and how culture operates is that we share these responsibilities. But it is, what is absolutely crucially important is that we have people within, and we pay them, actually, and we devote resources to it, who can engage directly with Roman writing and Roman history and Roman archaeology, because without it, whether it's good or bad or indifferent or genocidal or hegemonic or whatever, we can't be European. That's what I would say.
Un par de preguntas más, si hay alguien que desea unirse a alguna más.
Okay.
Bueno, ya cerramos el ciclo, 1, 2 y 3, ¿vale? Porque ya llevamos aquí mucho tiempo, me parece, y es el momento de empezar a ver si cerramos un poco.
Admirable life dedicated to Rome. We enter in time.
No se oye.
Yes, admirable life dedicated to Rome, and making a summary, like us.
Que no se.
I couldn't hear.
Sí? No.
No.
No. Sí? Just to make a summary. To Lyman, like, yes, that now it's perfect. I was saying admirable life dedicated to Rome, my admiration, really. Just to summarize, to layman, I am layman in Rome culture. If you were given the very difficult choice to preserve the 3 main contributions of Romans to mankind, which of them should be these 3 very difficult choices?
Blimey. That's almost impossible. I mean, I think that if there's one phrase which I would hope from Roman history was never ever forgotten, so it counts as a contribution to mankind. It was a phrase that was mentioned earlier, Tacitus discussing or putting in the mouth of a defeated Britain, the phrase which I think applies to every empire and every conquest: they make a desert and call it peace. Right? I mean, I think that is a phrase which deserves never to die out. Right? I then do, I'm afraid, go back. I mean, I've got to have one Monty Python thing in there, you know, and I do think, although every archaeologist would tell you that Roman water supply was more often used for decoration and fountains than it was used for drinking water, I still think there is something about the idea of plumbing and water engineering, even if it's like Segovia, that I don't ever want to lose. And for my third one, well, I suppose I think of myself as a historian and archaeologist, but this is a bit like the English program Desert Island Discs, where you have to choose what you're going to take to a mythical desert island with you if you're, when you have nothing else there. I'm going to have to take, and English are always given the complete works of Shakespeare, so I will take the complete works of Virgil.
Buenas tardes. Por lo que se está hablando hoy en esta conversación, ¿no se oye?
Ya no.
¿Se me oye? Ahora sí.
Ahora sí.
Por lo que está surgiendo en esta conversación, yo tengo la impresión de que el conocimiento de la historia es fundamental para la construcción de nuestra identidad. Y mi pregunta es, yo tengo la sensación también de que es mucho más fácil construir ese diálogo con la historia antigua y no con nuestra historia reciente. Yo querría saber si usted comparte esa idea y porque no sé si usted conoce la controversia que hay en este país referente a la memoria histórica. Desde muchos sectores de la sociedad se nos dice que es muy importante conocer nuestro pasado romano, nuestro pasado visigodo, pero también se nos dice que hay que olvidar nuestra historia reciente porque eso es reabrir heridas y porque si nos metemos en ese debate vamos a hacer patente un conflicto que todavía no se ha resuelto. No sé si usted sabe que en este país todavía hay más de 100.000 personas desaparecidas que están en las cunetas. Yo no sé si también en el Reino Unido se produce algo semejante, que es muy difícil relacionarse con la historia reciente y es mucho más fácil construir nuestra identidad acerca de cosas que sucedieron hace miles de años.
I know exactly what you mean. I do know a little bit about this, not very much. I mean, I think that you need both. I mean, you know, I suppose I would say my hope is that in some ways the freedom that we have to discuss ancient history, the fact that it's such a long time ago, it's nobody's relatives, it's nobody's grandfather, I think that teaches, I hope it teaches, a kind of set of criteria and practice and expertise in historical argument that can then be used in relation to much more difficult, awkward, edgy and very raw things later. The last thing I would want is that Roman history was used because it was nice and safe, you know, and we could just joke about Nero killing Christians and fiddling while Rome burnt. The point about learning how to think historically is that you then look at your recent past and at your present. And I think Rome, there are many reasons for studying Rome, it seems to me, but it's a good practice ground for talking about us. That's what I think.
Para finalizar el turno de preguntas, quería plantear una última cuestión y es, bueno, sabiendo que es una trabajadora incansable y todo, desde los más jóvenes hasta los más mayores, estamos siempre pendientes de todos los documentales y trabajos y libros que usted va publicando. Me gustaría que nos fuéramos de aquí con una primicia. Me gustaría saber si usted nos puede informar sobre algún proyecto actual en el que esté involucrada o tenga pensado en el futuro.
I can give you three, actually, very quickly. One, I'm going to leave Madrid on Sunday and go to Cadiz, where I'm starting a new documentary on Julius Caesar. I'm also just finished making, there was a very famous British television series about 30 years ago at least, by Kenneth Clarke, called Civilization. It was distinguished by the fact that Clarke did a history of European civilization and never came to Spain. We are remaking this series from a global perspective, and indeed we have been to Spain several times, and that will be out in February. Meanwhile, if only I got the time, I'm trying to finish a book on images of Roman emperors in Renaissance and later art.
Una vez más, perdón, la próxima, anunciar. Perdón, antes de finalizar esta sesión de hoy, que tenemos que decir que, bueno, yo no sé ustedes, pero nos lo hemos pasado muy bien y además hemos aprendido mucho. Les convocamos para el 20 de septiembre para hablar de una cosa muy interesante y muy romana. A la sombra de los campamentos, convivencia y relaciones sociales entre el ejército y la sociedad civil. Es una intervención que hará el profesor Sebastian Sommer de Múnich, y es que además es hoy día el encargado de todas las excavaciones de la zona de Baviera. Por tanto, es una personalidad en entendimiento y comprensión de todo lo que es el mundo militar, en el IMES, especialmente en el IMES alemán y en el IMES inglés. Él también estudió en Oxford, una parte de su formación, y creemos que es una de las autoridades que hoy día pueden hablarnos precisamente de esa relación tan importante entre un mundo que fue el mundo romano, donde lo militar pesaba tanto, y a la vez acompañaba a ese mundo un mundo civil que tenía pues también, digamos, unas formas de vida que nos pueden interesar mucho y que yo creo que pueden ayudar también en esta comprensión que queremos hacer y en este diálogo que queremos entablar con el mundo de la antigüedad y especialmente con el mundo romano. Y por tanto les convocamos, les animamos a que todos los miércoles de aquí al 20 de diciembre, de ahora al 20 de diciembre, en esta sala están convocados aquí, como ha dicho mi compañero, pues a disfrutar de la sabiduría, como hemos tenido la oportunidad de disfrutar hoy de la profesora Mary Beard, a la quien una vez más tenemos que agradecer muchas cosas.